A refinery at night is not supposed to look fragile. It is supposed to look permanent. From a distance, it looks like a city that has forgotten how to sleep. Towers glow in the dark. Pipes carry heat and pressure from one steel chamber to the next. Flare stacks breathe controlled fire into the sky. Crude oil arrives as a raw material, thick and stubborn, and then leaves as the liquids that keep a modern state moving. Gasoline, diesel, aviation kerosene, fuel oil. The liquids of ordinary life and the liquids of war. But then one night, the rhythm breaks. The glow changes. The fire is no longer controlled. Smoke rises where there should only be heat. Emergency lights move across the darkness. Somewhere inside the industrial maze, the machinery that separates crude oil into usable fuel stops doing its quiet work. And that is the moment a refinery stops looking permanent. It starts looking like a vulnerability. In this war, we usually look first at the front line. We look at trenches, maps, arrows, towns, drones, missiles, and brigades. But the deeper war is often happening somewhere else. It is happening inside budgets, fuel depots, export terminals, railway junctions, pumping stations, and refineries. It is happening in the places where a state turns money into ammunition, crude oil into diesel, and industrial capacity into military endurance. So when a Russian refinery goes dark, the real question is not only what burned. The real question is much colder. What happens when a country built on oil begins losing the machinery that turns oil into power? That is what this story actually is. It is not just another drone strike. It is not just another fireball over Russian territory. It is not just another claim from Kyiv or another denial from Moscow. This is about pressure building underneath Russia's energy system, and about the strange moment when Moscow itself began admitting that these attacks are creating real fuel problems. Because oil by itself is not enough. A barrel of crude under the ground is potential. A barrel of crude on a tanker is revenue. But crude inside a refinery becomes something more immediate. It becomes gasoline for civilian transport. It becomes diesel for trucks, trains, generators, logistics, and agricultural machinery. It becomes aviation kerosene for aircraft. It becomes the refined product that can be sold, moved, stored, rationed, or withheld. A refinery is where geology becomes power, and that is why Ukraine is attacking them. Today is June 12, 2026, and in the last 24 to 72 hours, the tempo has tightened. A major Russian refinery in Samara was struck. Another refinery in Krasnodar Krai was hit again. Oil pumping stations connected to product pipelines were attacked. Fires were reported at depots and rail-linked oil infrastructure. And Russia's own energy ministry issued a rare public statement admitting that fuel supply difficulties in several southern regions were linked to an increase in enemy aerial attacks. This is Professor Jang, and if you value calm, serious war economy analysis without the shouting, subscribe and stay with the story beneath the story. Let us start with the refinery that went dark. Overnight, on June 9th into June 10th, the Kuibishevsky refinery in Samara was struck. According to the fact pattern we have, both of its primary crude distillation units, CDU-4 and CDU-5, were destroyed, and processing was halted. The governor of Samara confirmed a drone attack, and 3 people were injured. The phrase crude distillation unit sounds technical, almost dry. But in a refinery, it is one of the most important pieces of the whole system. The CDU is the front door. It is where crude oil first enters the refining process and is separated into different fractions. Without that first stage, the rest of the refinery cannot simply continue as if nothing happened. If the CDU is disabled, the refinery's heartbeat is interrupted. Each of Kuibishev's 2 primary crude distillation units had a capacity of about 10,000 metric tons of crude, roughly 73,000 barrels per day. Together, that means about 146,000 barrels per day of primary processing capacity was taken offline from this one plant alone. That number matters, not because one number wins a war. It does not. It matters because every barrel that cannot be processed has to go somewhere else, wait somewhere else, or be sold as something less useful to Russia's domestic system. And every ton of gasoline, diesel, aviation kerosene, and fuel oil that does not come out of that refinery has to be replaced, rerouted, imported, rationed, or withheld from someone. This is how a strike on machinery becomes a pressure point in society. The Kuibyshev refinery is not a small symbolic facility. Its design capacity is about 7 million tons per year. In 2024, it processed 4.7 million tons of crude, around 94,400 barrels per day. Out of that came about 0.8 million tons of gasoline, 1.4 million tons of diesel, and 1.3 million tons of fuel oil. It also produces aviation kerosene. So when this refinery stops, it is not just a fire on a map. It is a subtraction from Russia's fuel system. Subtract gasoline, subtract diesel, subtract aviation kerosene, subtract fuel oil, subtract local supply, subtract exportable refined product. Subtract the easy assumption that Russia's rear areas are safe. And the distance is part of the story. Kuibyshev is in Samara Oblast, more than 900 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. This is not a target sitting at the edge of the battlefield. This is deep inside Russia's industrial interior, in a region connected to the Volga and Ural's economic space, a region that matters not only for energy but for production, transport, and logistics. That distance gives the strike its psychological weight. Ukraine is showing that the refinery war is no longer confined to the borderlands. It can reach deep into the machinery of Russia's rear. And once the rear stops feeling like the rear, every industrial facility becomes part of the war map. Kuibyshev also has a history. It was first struck by drones in March 2024 when one processing unit was damaged. It halted again after a UAV attack in August 2025 and resumed operations on August 21st after repairs. It was struck again in January 2026. Now in June 2026, it has been hit again 4 times in the war. That pattern matters more than any single explosion. It shows that Ukraine is not only hunting for spectacle, it is returning to the same industrial nodes because repeated pressure changes the economics of repair. A refinery can recover from one strike, it can reroute, it can patch, it can bring in crews and parts. But repeated strikes force a different question. How much capacity, time, money, and protection must Russia keep spending just to return to yesterday's level of functioning? That is the hidden cost of this campaign. It is not only the damage itself, it is the permanent uncertainty. A refinery manager cannot plan normal operations if the same facility has been hit in 2024, 2025, January 2026, and June 2026. An energy ministry cannot plan confidently if major units are under unscheduled repair. A military logistics planner cannot assume that every regional fuel hub will behave like it did before the war. This is the war underneath the war. But Kuibyshev is only one part of the pressure. The larger Samara refinery hub is now under extraordinary strain. By June 10th, all 3 Rosneft Samara hub refineries were simultaneously offline or reduced. Kuibyshev had just been struck. Syzran had been offline since May 21st after a drone strike and had not resumed operations as of June 11th. Novokuibyshevsk had also previously been hit. That is where the story moves from incident to system. 1 refinery down is a problem. 2 refineries down is a regional strain. 3 connected facilities offline or reduced at the same time becomes a logistics problem with political consequences. Where does the diesel come from instead? Which region is prioritized? Which factory receives fuel first? Which civilian market is told to wait? Which military supply chain is protected? Which product is imported? And which product is temporarily unavailable? This is the kind of pressure that does not always produce dramatic battlefield video, but it shapes the conditions under which war is sustained. Armies do not only need courage and equipment, they need fuel, they need transport, they need predictable supply, and behind those supply lines, the civilian economy still has to function enough to support the state. I want to be honest about what we do not know. We do not have independent confirmation that Russian frontline units are running out of fuel because of these strikes. We do not have proof that a specific brigade, aircraft unit, or ammunition convoy has been immobilized because Kuibyshev went dark. Russia prioritizes military supply chains. It has strategic reserves. It can reroute supplies. It can import from Belarus or Central Asian neighbors. And historically, Russia has shown real resilience after energy infrastructure attacks. So no, this does not mean the Russian army suddenly stops. But both things can be true. Russia can continue fighting, and its fuel system can still be under real stress. Russia can adapt, and the adaptation can still be expensive. Russia can export more crude, and the domestic fuel market can still tighten. Russia can call shortages temporary, and temporary shortages can still create political pressure. That is why Moscow's own words matter so much. On June 9th, Russia's energy ministry issued a rare public statement. It said that fuel and energy sector enterprises had faced an uptick in enemy aerial attacks, leading to temporary difficulties with fuel supplies in several southern regions. That sentence is careful. It is bureaucratic, it is designed to sound controlled, but it is still an admission. For much of this war, Russian officials have tried to describe drone strikes on refineries as local incidents, fires, debris impacts, or temporary interruptions. They avoid the larger systemic meaning. They do not want citizens to connect distant fireballs with the price or availability of fuel. They do not want the public to see a Ukrainian drone campaign as something that reaches into daily life. But this statement made the connection. Enemy aerial attacks, fuel and energy enterprises, temporary difficulties with fuel supplies, several southern regions. That is not Ukrainian messaging. That is Moscow acknowledging the mechanism. And the ministry also announced an industry-wide task force to ensure the stable operation of the country's entire energy sector. Governments do not usually announce industry-wide task forces when a system is relaxed. They announce them when coordination has become urgent. They announce them when supply, repair, transport, and communication all need central management. The word temporary may be true. It may also be doing a lot of political work. Temporary is what a government says when it wants people to remain calm. Temporary tells consumers not to panic. Temporary tells markets not to overreact. Temporary tells regional officials that the center has a plan. But temporary does not mean painless. Temporary repairs still cost money. Temporary shortages still create queues. temporary disruptions still distort prices. Temporary uncertainty still makes planning harder. And this was not the only admission. On June 5th, Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak said that Russia's oil production was indeed lower compared to the beginning of 2026, and that Russia had a number of refineries under unscheduled repairs. Again, listen to the language. Unscheduled repairs, that phrase is almost the quiet center of the whole story. Refineries are supposed to shut down according to planned maintenance cycles. They are supposed to manage repair windows, product mixes, crude intake, labor schedules, and export commitments. When a refinery enters unscheduled repair, the entire system loses predictability, and predictability is one of the most valuable things in an energy economy. A refinery strike does not only damage equipment, it damages calendars, it damages assumptions, it damages the confidence that next month's throughput will look like last month's plan. Now widen the lens beyond Samara. On June 11th, Bloomberg and OPEC data confirmed that Russia's crude output in May had fallen to 9.009 million barrels per day, the lowest in a year. That was 690,000 barrels per day below Russia's OPEC plus target. Separately, crude processing rates in June had fallen to their lowest in 2 decades, according to EA Analytics and Energy Aspects. That is where the refinery war connects directly to the budget war. Russia's war is not funded by rhetoric. It is funded by money. And a large part of that money comes from the energy system. Oil is not only a commodity for Russia, it is a fiscal bloodstream. It supports the budget. It supplies foreign exchange. It helps sustain the ruble. It gives the state room to spend on war, subsidies, salaries, repairs, procurement, and political management. The fact pack shows that Russia is adapting in one obvious way. Its average 4-week maritime crude exports to May 31st rose to 3.64 million barrels per day, up from 3.17 million barrels per day in the 4 weeks to April 17th. In simple terms, Russia appears to be rerouting more unrefined crude to export rather than processing it domestically. That makes sense. If refineries are damaged or under repair, and Russia still needs hard currency, it can push more crude outward. But this adaptation contains a weakness. Crude exported by sea does not fill a civilian car in southern Russia. It does not fuel a tractor during harvest. It does not become diesel for a distribution chain unless someone refines it. It does not become aviation kerosene for military or civilian aircraft inside Russia unless the refining system works. So Russia can preserve some revenue while worsening the domestic product shortage. That is the paradox. Russia can be an oil giant and still face fuel stress. It can have crude and still lack enough refined product in the right place at the right time. Ukraine's campaign is designed to exploit exactly that gap. It is not trying to make Russian oil disappear from the earth. It is trying to damage the machines that transform Russian oil into mobility, export value, and military endurance. The export bans show the pressure more clearly. On April 1st, 2026, Russia banned gasoline exports. On June 3rd, it banned jet fuel exports through November 30th, 2020. A gasoline export ban can be explained as domestic market protection. A jet fuel export ban can also be explained as precaution. But together, in the middle of repeated refinery strikes, they point to a government worried about domestic supply. And then there are the shortages. At least 25 Russian regions are experiencing gasoline shortages or fuel supply disruptions, according to the fact pack. Gasoline prices are up 4.8% nationally since the start of 2026. In 1 week, the national average reached 67.83 rubles per liter. Diesel was at 79.46 rubles per liter nationally. Those are civilian numbers, but they are also political numbers. Fuel is one of the most direct ways an ordinary person feels the war. A drone strike hundreds of kilometers away may feel abstract. A refinery name may mean nothing to a commuter. But the pump price is intimate. A shortage is intimate. A farmer, truck driver, taxi driver, factory manager, or family preparing for summer travel does not need a military map to understand that fuel is becoming harder or more expensive. That is how the war comes home. But the immediate target is still Russia's war capacity. Refineries convert crude into the fuels that keep military logistics alive. Diesel moves trucks and armored support vehicles. Aviation kerosene supports aircraft operations. Fuel oil has industrial uses. Gasoline keeps civilian systems and some transport functioning. When those outputs become harder to supply, the state has to prioritize. On June 8th, before Krybyshev, the Grushoveya Balka oil depot near Novorossiysk was hit, with fires reported. Krasnoarmeysk station in Saratov Oblast and Krasny Yar station in Volgograd Oblast, each with 50,000 cubic meter tanks, were ablaze. These are not all identical targets, but they belong to the same energy chain: storage, movement, distribution, and supply. Then, overnight on June 9th into June 10th, the SBU reportedly struck the Vidorovo and Lubkovo oil pumping stations in Vladimir Oblast, about 700 kilometers from the border. These stations feed the Moscow Ring oil product pipeline and Baltic Sea port export routes. NASA FIRMS. Heat anomalies confirmed fires. Now consider Ofipsky. On June 11th, the Ofipsky refinery in Krasnodar Krai was struck for the third time in 2026. A large fire was confirmed by the Krasnodar Krai operational headquarters and later extinguished. Russia's defense ministry claimed that 330 UAVs were intercepted overnight. Ofipsky has a design capacity of 6.25 million tons per year. It is part of the SOFMAR group, and according to the fact pack, it supplies fuel to the Russian armed forces. It had already been hit on March 13th and 14th, when drones damaged the AT-22/4 primary processing unit. The affiliated Krasnodar refinery and Ofipsky together had combined throughput of 7.2 million tons in 2024 and 3 million tons in the first half of 2025. The scale of the campaign has increased sharply. At least 31 Ukrainian strikes on Russian refineries, oil export terminals, and pipeline infrastructure took place in May 2026 alone, the highest monthly total since the start of the full-scale invasion. Another count says there were 38 refinery attacks between January and May 2026, including 16 in May alone. The fact pack also notes that Ukraine struck 8 of Russia's 10 biggest refineries in a single month. None of these facts alone proves collapse. Together they prove stress. And in a long war, stress accumulates. I want to pause here and avoid overclaiming. There is a temptation in wartime commentary to turn every successful strike into a decisive turning point. That temptation is dangerous. It creates false expectations. It underestimates the opponent. It confuses damage with defeat. Russia is not helpless. It has a large energy system. It has technical capacity. It has reserves. It has neighboring sources of fuel. It can prioritize the military over civilians. It can route crude outward for revenue. It can repair damaged facilities. It can absorb pain that would be politically difficult in a more open system. Russian resilience has been underestimated before. In 2024 and 2025, after major refinery strikes, Russia managed to reroute processing to less damaged facilities and maintain overall military fuel supply. The Russian military has not been confirmed to have run out of fuel on any front. That matters. It means we should not pretend the refinery campaign has already achieved battlefield paralysis. That is what we are watching. OilX data says refinery utilization has fallen 14% since the beginning of 2026 and remains about 20% below pre-war levels. We need to be honest about uncertainty here too. That figure includes both strike damage and scheduled maintenance. The precise share caused by Ukrainian strikes alone is unclear, but the direction is unmistakable. Russian refining is weaker than it was before the full-scale war, and the damage is happening under sanctions. That matters because some refinery components, especially primary distillation units, are difficult to replace or repair quickly when specialized Western equipment is unavailable. The fact pack's strategic thread is clear. CDUS are among the hardest components to repair under sanctions, and repair windows can stretch from weeks to months. That is why Andriy Zakrevsky's phrase is so striking. He described the industry as turning into an emissions black hole that sucks trillions of rubles from the Russian budget. The OPEC plus angle adds another layer. Russia has consistently produced below its OPEC plus target throughout 2025 and 2026, partly due to strikes, according to the fact pack. In May 2026, output was 690,000 barrels per day, below target. This is not only a domestic issue, it creates diplomatic and revenue complications. In a world where oil production quotas shape relationships among producers, being below target because of damage is not the same as voluntarily restraining output from strength. It suggests constraint. And constraint is the word that keeps returning. Constraint on refining, constraint on exports, constraint on domestic supply, constraint on repairs, constraint on air defense, constraint on the budget. Ukraine's long-range strike campaign is a campaign of constraint. Now we should also talk about the far rear alarm effect. The fact pack notes that Omsk Oblast declared a drone threat for the first time in this conflict roughly 2,300 kilometers from the front line. This needs caution. The actual capability to strike Omsk is analytically disputed. Some analysts see it as psychological pressure rather than proof of a reliable Ukrainian operational reach that far. But even psychological pressure has operational effects. If a far rear region declares a drone threat, officials must communicate risk. Industrial sites must think about protection. Air defense planners must consider coverage. Governors must prepare the population for something that once seemed impossible. The mental map of the war expands. And for Russia, that expansion creates a dilemma. Where does it place air defense? Near the front? Around Moscow? Around refineries, around pumping stations, around oil depots, around ports, around military factories, around aircraft plants, around missile production facilities, around power infrastructure, around export terminals. No country has infinite air defense. The more Ukraine can make Russia defend everything, the harder it is for Russia to defend any single category perfectly. This is why deep strikes matter even when their direct damage is limited. They force choices, and choices reveal priorities. It is not always visible in one day's footage. But over months, it changes the cost of the war. This is why the current moment feels different. It is not only that Ukraine hit a refinery, it is that the refinery hit sits inside a chain of official admissions and policy responses. April 1st, gasoline export ban. June 3rd, jet fuel export ban through November 30th. June 5th, Novak admits oil production is lower than at the beginning of 2026 and says several refineries are under unscheduled repairs. June 8th, oil depots and stations burn. June 9th into June 10th, Cheboksary is hit, with both primary CDUs destroyed and processing halted. June 9th into June 10th, Vitorovo and Lobkovo pumping stations are struck. June 9th, the Energy Ministry admits temporary fuel difficulties in several southern regions due to increased enemy aerial attacks. June 10th, all three Rosneft Samara hub plants are offline or reduced. June 11th, Afipsky is struck again. June 11th, data confirms crude output at the lowest level in a year, and crude processing rates in June at their lowest in 2 decades. That is not a normal week. That is a compression of pressure. And compression matters because bureaucracies can handle one problem at a time. They are built for procedures, not cascading surprises. When multiple energy nodes are hit, multiple refineries are damaged, export bans are active, shortages are reported, and output data worsens, the state has to coordinate under stress. This does not mean the Kremlin is losing control tomorrow. It means the war has entered systems that the Kremlin needs to keep predictable. The evidence does show that Ukraine's long-range strike campaign has become one of the most economically significant parts of the war. It shows that Russia's refining sector is being hit repeatedly, not symbolically. It shows that primary processing units are being damaged. It shows that the Samara hub is under unusual simultaneous strain. It shows that Afipsky has become a repeated target. It shows that pumping stations, depots, terminals, and pipeline-linked infrastructure are part of the campaign. It shows that Russia is responding with export bans, task forces, admissions of unscheduled repairs, and public explanations for fuel difficulties. But the evidence does show something more subtle, and perhaps more important, and that is why the Cheboksary refinery matters. Not because one refinery decides the war, but because it represents a deeper vulnerability. Russia's strength has always rested partly on scale. Vast territory, vast resources, vast energy production, vast ability to absorb pain. Ukraine cannot match that scale directly, so it is targeting conversion points. The places where Russian scale has to pass through machinery before it becomes usable power. That is the lesson. Ukraine is not trying to make Russia run out of oil. Ukraine is trying to make Russian oil harder to use, harder to move, harder to refine, harder to protect, and harder to hide from the Russian public. And in a long war, that kind of pressure can matter as much as a battlefield advance. Because wars are not only lost when an army retreats, sometimes they are weakened when the system behind the army begins to spend more and more energy simply staying in the same place. When repair becomes routine, when export bans become necessary, when shortages become public, when the rear becomes nervous, when the budget must feed the war and repair the infrastructure damaged by the war at the same time. That is not collapse, it is erosion. And erosion is slower, quieter, and often more dangerous than collapse, because leaders can deny it for a long time. That is the cold logic beneath this story. Moscow can still fight, Russia can still export crude. The refineries may be repaired, the shortages may ease, the military may remain supplied. Any honest analysis has to say that clearly. But the strategic picture has changed. Ukraine is finding ways to reach into the Russian war economy and touch the machinery that turns oil into force. And this week, one of those machines went dark in Samara. Another burned again in Krasnodar. Pumping stations tied to major product routes were hit. Southern regions were acknowledged to be facing fuel difficulties. And the Russian government carefully but unmistakably admitted why. So the question that lingers is not whether one refinery strike changes everything. The question is whether enough small fires in enough hidden places can change the cost of power itself. Because a state can survive many explosions. But can it survive a war in which the machines that feed its strength are slowly taught to fear the night? This is Professor Jang. I'll see you in the next one.